Exercise B8, contrasting relative pronouns. In this exercise, you'll have a choice of relative pronouns. Sometimes you can use one, sometimes more than one. Let's take a look at the first few. The first one says, the girl whom I sat next to in math class always knew the answers. Can we use a relative pronoun that? The girl that I sat next to in math class always knew the answers. Yes, we can use that. Can we use the word who? The girl who I sat next to in math class always knew the answers. Yes. Can we use the word which? The girl which? Don't use the word which because it modifies an animate, a person. So when you're using a person, use who or that. But when you're using a thing or an idea, if you're talking about a thing or an idea, something that's not a person, then you can use the relative pronoun which. Can we omit that pronoun and just use the girl I sat next to? Yes, in fact we can. The girl I sat next to in math class. Why is that? I sat next to someone. That's an object, right? I sat next to. We may omit the relative pronoun if it's an object. Number 2, I was surprised to see the log house my father grew up. Can we use the word where? I was surprised to see the log house where my father grew up. Yes, the word where can connect my father grew up with the log house. Can we use in which? I was surprised to see the log house in which my father grew up. Yes, because my father grew up in the log house. Can we omit the relative pronoun? I was surprised to see the log house my father grew up. We must not omit this because we need the preposition in. My father grew up in a house, so that's why we have to use in which. If we put the word in at the end, then we can omit the relative pronoun, or we could use the word which, or we could use the word that. So another way to say the sentence is, I was surprised to see the log house that my father grew up in. Or, I was surprised to see the log house my father grew up in. Number 3, my grandmother, maiden name was Faust, grew up in Germany. Can we use the word who? My grandmother who who must be followed by a verb. Maiden name is a noun. Can we use which? My grandmother, which maiden name? Nope, because which is not used for people, and also we need a possessive relationship. So how about whose? My grandmother, whose maiden name was Faust, grew up in Germany. Perfect. Whose is possessive, and whose goes together with the noun phrase maiden name. Whose maiden name. So we could separate those two clauses into simple sentences like this. My grandmother grew up in Germany. That's first sentence. Her maiden name was Faust. That's the second sentence. So you see her maiden name is the possessive. And when we join them together, we use the relative pronoun whose to show this possession. Now I'd like you to try the remaining sentences and then check your answers with the answer key. Exercise B9, restrictive and non-restrictive relative clauses. In part A, you need to combine each pair of sentences where marked with the caret symbol. Use relative clauses. So the first one is going to be the main or independent clause. The second one is going to be the relative clause. Now you need to add commas where necessary, and you'll recall that it's necessary to add commas for non-restrictive clauses. Take a look at number 1. My parents, caret, had 4 children. They immigrated to this country 30 years ago. The second one we can change into who immigrated to this country 2 years ago, and then we insert it after the word parents. Now the question is, do we need to add commas or not? Yes, because if you say my parents had 4 children, it's very clear, because my parents means my mother and my father. And of course, I only have one mother and one father, so you would never ask me which parents. Therefore, the second relative clause is non-restrictive, and your sentence requires commas. My parents, comma, who immigrated to this country 30 years ago, comma, had 4 children. Now let's look at number 2. I have one older brother. He lives in Los Angeles. All right, so we're going to put he lives in Los Angeles as who lives in Los Angeles for our relative clause. Then we'll put it after the word one older brother. Do I have more than one older brother? No, apparently not. Apparently there's only one. So this is a non-restrictive clause. You won't ask me which older brother because you know that I only have one. I have one older brother, comma, who lives in Los Angeles. Period. Okay, now you try the remaining items and check the answer key, but not before you do part B. This is where you can choose 4 or 5 friends or family members and write 2 simple statements about each of them. You can use these questions to help you write about them. For example, how old are they? Where do they live? What do they do? Where do they work? What do they like to do? What else can you say about them? And then you can write a couple of sentences about each of them. So you can say, my mother is 50 years old. She likes to draw. My brother Julio lives in Mexico City. He attends graduate school there. So those are 2 simple sentences about 2 different people. And then you can show how to combine these sentences about each person using non-restrictive relative clauses. For example, my mother is 50 years old. She likes to draw becomes my mother, comma, who is 50 years old, comma, likes to draw, period. And the one about my brother becomes my brother Julio lives in Mexico City, comma, where he attends graduate school, period. So those are some examples of sentence combination using non-restrictive relative clauses. Here's a usage note using which to modify a clause. Non-restrictive relative clauses beginning with which are sometimes used to modify the entire main clause rather than just a single noun or noun phrase. This occurs most often in conversation and in formal writing. Here's an example. It's starting to rain, which means the picnic will have to be postponed. So you see, which means is the verb, the subject is which, and it refers not to the word rain. It's not rain means, but it refers to the entire concept, the entire sentence, it's starting to rain. That means because of the rain, the picnic will have to be postponed. So the entire idea expressed in the independent clause, it's starting to rain, is expressed by the pronoun which. And these are all non-restrictive, which means that they're followed by a comma, and there's a drop in the voice when you're speaking it, and there's a drop in the voice on the relative pronoun. It's starting to rain, which means like that. All right, and exercise B10, referring to gerunds and infinitives. In part A, you need to add a relative clause with which to each sentence. And you can use the sentences from the box. All of those sentences start with that. That proves she's not very responsible. That's exactly what I hoped she would do. That's what I wanted to do in the first place. That isn't very convenient for me. That's going to make it hard for me to finish my work. That means I won't be home until late. In these sentences, the word that refers to an idea expressed in an independent clause. All right, so we're going to see the independent clause followed by a comma below. And then we're going to choose one of the sentences in the box. And instead of using the word that, which is a demonstrative pronoun, not a relative pronoun, that proves, that's exactly, notice the way we say it is also, in oral English, very strong, very high, very long. It's not a relative pronoun, which is always low, that. So it's spelled the same, but it's not pronounced the same in connected speech. We're going to exchange that and replace it with the relative pronoun which. The relative pronoun which begins a non-restrictive clause. So, for example, number 1, I told my mother I'd go shopping with her today, which means I won't be home until late. Which means I won't be home until late. Now, you try adding relative clauses to the following sentences or sentence starters. All of these are main clauses or independent clauses. That's what you'll do in part A, and then check the answer key. In part B, you can add which clauses to modify these sentence starters. They are all independent clauses, and you should use ideas of your own. So for example, we have, I lost my cell phone this morning. Now maybe you lost it for good, or maybe you just misplaced it. Let's say you just misplaced it, all right? Maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing. For many of you, you'll feel a loss that something is missing and you've got a lot of things on your cell phone and you can't use that to communicate anymore. You might say something like this: I lost my cell phone this morning, which inconvenienced me because I was supposed to call my lawyer. All right, so that word which refers back to the whole idea expressed in the main clause, I lost my cell phone this morning. On the other hand, perhaps you think it's a bit of freedom from the digital world, always being stuck to communicating and having to communicate. So maybe you'll think of, wow, it's actually giving me a breather. I'm not tethered to my cell phone. So you might say, I lost my cell phone this morning, which was a blessing in disguise, since I could spend the day less tethered to the digital world. But later I found it on the bottom of my sofa, and so now I'm connected again. All right, so these are some other starters. I have to catch up on my homework. The weather is supposed to be terrible today. The movie doesn't end until midnight. So use these sentence starters to think of how that may affect another action, which you will write about in the relative clause.